and Esmy for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will be continuing to produce virtual content this fall, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include material scientist Anissa Ramirez with Untold Stories of Innovation, a live podcast recording of Deep End Friends about Black healing, Cass Sunstein on what to do with too much information, and more. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to the event cancellations and ever-changing landscape. We hope you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time. You can make a donation by clicking the donate button at the bottom of your screen or becoming a member. You can donate online or text Town Hall to 44321 to give. Our partner booksellers have also been hit by the negative effects of the COVID outbreak and can use your support as well. If you are interested in supporting local independent bookstores by purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through Elliott Bay Books. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for rewatching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. Suketu and Esmy will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. You can also vote on which questions will be addressed by clicking the arrow next to the question to upvote it. We cannot guarantee that we will be able to address every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civic series is supported by Real Network Foundation, True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and Winco Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching. Esmy Jimenez is a bilingual journalist born in Mexico and raised in rural Washington state. She covers immigration and identity in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. She is an NPR Next Gen Radio and ProPublica Ida B. Wells Data Institute Fellow, and her work has appeared in NPR, High Country News, and the Washington Post. Suketu Mehta is a New York-based author and associate professor of journalism at New York University. He was born in Calcutta and discusses immigration in much of his writing. His work has been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, Harper's, Time, and GQ. He has won the Wings Writing Award and the O. Henry Prize, and a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship for his fiction. He has also written original screenplays for films including New York, I Love You. His book, Maximum City, Bombay Lost and Found, was published in 2004. It won the Kiriyama Prize and the Hutch Crossword Award and was a finalist for a number of other prominent literary prizes, including the 2005 Pulitzer Prize. He is currently working on a nonfiction book about immigrants in contemporary New York, for which he has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. Mehita's book, This Land is Our Land, An Immigrant's Manifesto, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Suketu Mehta and Esmy Jimenez.
I feel the need to clap. Thank you for being here with us. I'm very excited to have this conversation. As we were talking a little bit earlier, I was like, oh, this is so excellent to just get to kind of nerd out with someone else about immigration. I just want to dive into one of the things that stuck out about the book immediately, and that was corporate colonialism. You say colonialism isn't over, right? It's not even in the past yet. Corporate colonialism is the new colonialism. Tell me a little bit more about that. What do you mean?
Thank you, Esmy. We think of colonialism as something that happened in the past, a bunch of British people in solar toupees going around the tropics. And but it's not just that. People around the world still have to live with the effects of colonialism. And I'll illustrate what I mean with a story. So while I was reporting for the book, I was in the city of Tangier in Morocco, where a lot of Africans come to the city, which is at the tip of Africa, kind of the northernmost part and the closest to Europe. And when you're in Tangier, you can look across the Strait of Gibraltar and literally see Europe across the strait. So I became friends with a family from the country of Guinea. There were a mother, a father, and a newborn child. And they told me that they were going to try to cross the Mediterranean in a tiny boat, basically like a beach dinghy. And they were going to drug their child, their first child, so that the child would stay quiet during the crossing. And I was really scared for the child. I said, please think before you do this, it could really harm the baby. And then it got me thinking about what was it that drove this little family? What desperation forced them to make this crossing, taking their firstborn in their arms and crossing to Europe. They were in their 20s. So I started asking them about their life in Guinea. And basically, there was no life possible in Guinea. Now, Guinea is not a poor country. It's got up to half the world's bauxite, which is, you and I probably don't go shopping for bauxite in our daily life, but it actually is a huge component of many of the things that we need to live. And most of this bauxite is owned by a hedge fund called Oxif. It's might be the world's largest publicly traded hedge fund. So this hedge fund, which owns this bauxite in Guinea, had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines to the SEC and the Justice Department because it was bribing officials in Africa. It was in cahoots with local leaders in places like Guinea to basically steal the material and the minerals of these countries. And as a result, the direct result of this upon individual lives is that a young family has to take their newborn in their arms and try to cross the Mediterranean in a dinghy because their wealth has been stolen. So in my book, I've got all these figures about what happens to these countries who have minerals, who have resources. Every year, $150 billion leaves Africa alone for what I call tax havens. So when a multinational like Shell goes into a country like Nigeria, it's not as if the oil that they extract from Nigeria, that the money goes back to Nigerians. Most of it goes to the Cayman Islands or the city of London, where they've got these banks where they can effectively hide this money from local taxation. So that kind of colonialism in my book, I submit, has replaced British colonialism and French colonialism.
Yeah, I noticed that you were talking about too how, when we talk about things are getting better, overall, globally, things are always getting better. But then you point out that global inequality, while it's going down at the international level, really there's issues about equality within countries themselves. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. So the biggest inequality in today's world is the inequality of citizenship. If you are born in Haiti, and if your best friend is born in Norway, if everything else is equal, you have the same talents, you've got the same intelligence, you've got the same drive, that one factor of you being born in Haiti and your friend being born in Norway will decisively shape your lives. And your friend who's born in Norway, all of the factors being equal, will have a dramatically better life than you. In 1960, in the post-colonial world, citizens of the richest country were 33 times richer than the citizens of the poorest country. By 2000, citizens of the richest country were 134 times richer. So that gap actually between the richest and the poorest has grown worldwide, but within countries, inside countries like the United States, that inequality has grown like never before. Today, 4 people on the planet, all men, own more than half of the planet, or 3.5 billion people combined. Think about it. 4 men own more than half the planet combined. So this is the world we're living in. And so in my book, I show the connections between that kind of incredible inequality and the reasons why people flee. Again, to get back to inequality and colonialism, between 1970 and 2010, $872 billion left Mexico in what I call illegal financial outflows for the United States. $872 billion, which is an enormous amount of money. Most of it went from corporations doing business in Mexico to American banks. In the same time, 16 million Mexicans came to the United States. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were just following the money. It was their money. So when people move, as I show in my book, they're moving not because they hate their homes or their language or their families. They're moving because the rich countries have left the poor countries no choice, because they have, through colonialism, corporate colonialism, war, and climate change, they have made, in many cases, the poor countries literally uninhabitable.
I know one of the things you talk about is saying, nations have to figure out, they have to make a choice, right? Reparations or migration. This seems like very strong binary, though. Can you explain that for me a little?
Sure. I actually wrote a couple of op-eds in the New York Times and the Washington Post last year, which occasioned much outrage and many death threats. So I'm calling for immigration as reparations. There's a much needed and long delayed debate in this country about reparations, both to the descendants of African Americans for the wealth that was taken from their ancestors during slavery. Basically, these are the people that built much of the country, and they never got paid for it. And it's only right that the descendants should get paid for it. The same sort of, if we are to be a just word, then since the rich countries have stolen the future of the poor countries, they can either send money to them, and the foreign aid that they send is a pittance compared to what is really owed. And I'll give you just one example. The amount of silver that was shipped from the colonies in Latin America to Europe between 1503 and the early 1800s would amount to a debt of $165 trillion in today's dollars that Europe owes Latin America today. So either, that Latin America owes Europe. So either Europe pays 165 trillion to Latin America today, or it lets in Latinos not to steal and to take, but to work. So the story was, actually the book begins with a story that my grandfather once told me. My grandfather was born in Calcutta, in India, and then he moved to Kenya. And he worked in Kenya, which was then a colony, a British colony, all his life. And then he retired in England. He had a British passport. So he's sitting in a park in London one day in the 1990s, minding his own business. And then this elderly British gent comes up to him and he says, "You, why don't you go back to where you came from?" And my grandfather, he said, and why should I go back? And then the British guy says, "Why are you here?" And my grandfather says, "Because we are the creditors," he says to the British man. "You came to my country, you took all my gold and my diamonds, so we have come here to collect. We are here because you were there." So when I make the case for reparations, what I'm saying is, and it's not just colonialism, take war. We, the United States, went into Iraq and launched an illegal and unnecessary war in which 1 million Iraqis lost their lives. And it was our fault. Well, I submit that we should let 1 million living Iraqis into the United States today as payment, as reparations. And it's not just war. I mean, when we talk about the civil wars that are going on in Latin America right now, in the Northern Triangle, Honduras, El Salvador. When we talk about the traffic in guns, 3/4 of all the guns in Mexico originate in the United States. 98% of all the guns in the Bahamas originate in the United States. We sell them the guns in which have devastated these countries, and then we buy their drugs. We produce the gangs, prisons. MS-13 began not in El Salvador, but in the prisons of California. And then we export these people. And then we are shocked when they try to come into the country. Again, the vast majority of them, not to rob or to rape, but to work and to send money back to their families. So what I'm saying is that the rich country owe it to the poor countries to let in their migrants as payment for colonialism, corporate colonialism, war, and climate change. And when they do, my book is an angry book, but it's got a happy ending. Because when people come, everyone benefits. The migrants, because they get to, for many of them, it's the difference between life and death. The rich countries, because they're not making enough babies. The United States, for years now, has not been making babies at the replacement fertility rate, and it's even more dire in many European countries and particularly in Japan. So we need these migrants, and it helps the countries that they leave behind, because remittances, the money people send back in $5 and $10 euros, is the best and most targeted way of helping the global poor.
I know that the way that you're framing this, right, is that there is something that is owed, and that the rich countries like the US, like Europe, kind of need to, settle their debt in a sense. But clearly places like the US and the European Union are not doing that. They're tightening their borders. They're making it harder for people to immigrate, even legally. What happens then?
So the virus has given xenophobes a pass to create the most draconian restrictions on immigration. And this is self-defeating. Just as the human body, the immune system goes into an overdrive when it encounters the virus, and in many cases, this is how you die. It's your own immune system going into overdrive. In the United States, in some of the European countries, the body politic has gone into overdrive and dramatically restricted immigration of all kinds, documented, undocumented, semi-documented. In the US, asylum has been almost eliminated, ostensibly for health reasons. This is the reason that the administration gave, that they would be bringing in the virus with them. If anything, most of the countries that they come from have a lower death rate than the US does from the virus. Or for economic reasons. They say we need to protect American jobs, which most economists say is hogwash. So they're using the virus to create the restrictions. And, there is a case to be made for temporary restrictions on movement from hot zones, right? This is if there's you need to prevent people coming in from Wuhan for some time because the virus is originated. There are legitimate health reasons to do that. But to erect a permanent ban on all people coming in from China hurts not only the Chinese, but it hurts us. The only way that the virus can be defeated is through more global migration, not less. It's almost as if the virus has a mind of its own, and it knows how to prey on human divisions. This is how the British ruled India, for example, is divide and conquer. And so since the virus came along, it's been splitting us into not only warring nations, people enacting travel restrictions, trade restrictions, but within countries, restrictions on movement between this state and that, and angry words saying, you're more at fault than we are, in New York versus Rhode Island, on and on. So the only way we can fight this is if we come together, not just as a country, but as a species, and tackle not just this virus, but all the other pandemics that are going to come after this one.
I hear what you're saying, but I also know that people would say, there's a limited amount of resources. Clearly, there was not enough hospital beds with COVID, right? Or there's not enough space. There's already a difficult time for young people to find jobs sometimes. Like, what do we do with that? How do we hold that truth as well?
Right. So let's take, one of the objections, one of the points you raised. There's a limited amount of space. The United States ranks 191st in the world for density. That is, there are 190 countries on the planet which are more dense than the United States. It's among the emptiest countries on the planet. It's got 86 people per square mile, and 80% of the US lives in 3% of the continent. Half of all US counties are losing population. If you go to rural Maine, rural Vermont, or much of the Midwest, these are places that desperately need people. I mean, Canada has realized this. Canada is looking to triple its immigration intake. They need warm bodies for cold places. And I've looked at a lot of economic studies about immigration and jobs, and the vast majority of economists agree that immigrants, when they come in, they are job creators, not job takers. Migrants are 14% of the US population, but we're 29% of the doctors and 40% of the medical and life scientists. These are the people who are actively working on a vaccine. Immigrants at just one American university, MIT, have won more Nobel Prizes than all the Nobel Prizes ever won by the country of China. So, anyone that looks around, particularly the cities of the US, see how essential immigrants are to the working of the country. And generally, the higher the number of migrants that you let in, the more the GDP of the country increases. Now, of course, I'm not in my book calling for open borders. I'm calling for open hearts. So I make plenty of economic arguments why the rich countries owe it to the poor countries to let in their people since they've despoiled them. But in the end, the argument I'm making is for ordinary people, not just in this country, but around the world. And not just in the rich countries, but also in countries like the country of my birth, India, which sees Bangladeshis with the same kind of fear and hatred that many Americans see Mexicans, or South Africa, which has these policies against Zimbabweans and Nigerians, as the French do against Arabs. Around the world, we've retreated into our narrow concept of nation. And the entire system of visas and passports is only about 100 years old. For most of our history as a species, we've always migrated. During the age of Great Migration, 1/4 of Europe up and moved to the United States. And what happened? The US rose to the top of world wealth and power. So when people move, it's generally a good thing. And it's only lately that we've been programmed by people like Fox News to think of it as an unnatural thing and as an invasion. The immigrant armada that is coming to shores is actually a rescue fleet.
I was curious though, where does this leave, indigenous folks? I feel like even, the title of the book, This Land is Our Land, right, kind of implies we're all nations of immigrant, we should all accept immigrants more. But where does that leave Native movements, especially ones that do ask for land back, like those in Australia or Brazil?
Absolutely. So the indigenous people never had a choice about who immigrated to their shores, right? And it's the same hypocrisy that, before you ask yourself, should you ask permission to cross someone's borders? Ask yourself, have the West ever asked permission to cross any borders? But for the indigenous people, if anyone has a right to say, ask me for permission before you come into my country, they do, right? But they've been reduced to a tiny sliver of the population. They have almost no voice in running the country. And I'd be personally interested in asking their opinions about who should come in and what kind of people and with what skills. But I don't think that this administration has ever asked any of the indigenous people who they would like to come to this country.
You had mentioned that this is an angry book. You wrote it right after the election in 2016. And I remember one of the things that I heard from some folks in response negatively to Trump's election was that they wanted to move to Canada, right? And I noticed that in the book, you briefly mentioned that there's kind of a difference in when people talk about refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, and then expats. Tell me a little bit about that.
So etymology is destiny. Whether you're classified as a traveler, a tourist, an expat, a migrant, can literally make the difference between life and death. Whether you're an economic refugee or a political refugee means that you could either live or die. And so I lived in, I taught in NYU Abu Dhabi for a while, and it was interesting that all the black and brown people there in the Emirates were generally called migrants, and the white people were generally called expats. And there was something very romantic and glamorous about it, like Hemingway in 1920s Paris and Gertrude Stein, and they were expats. They got to be expats, and all the other people who were scrubbing toilets were just migrants. So there's this kind of terminology, and we see the same thing about whether you cross the border, whether you have papers or not. No human being is illegal. So I really detest this term, illegal immigrant. And crossing a border shouldn't be a crime. And we've seen this kind of criminalization of migration really gather steam in the last, certainly since the election. And now, not only is it a crime, it's often a capital crime. There have been politicians, including people in this administration, who've openly called for shooting people. I mean, Trump has been speculating about using some sort of heat ray to deter migrants coming in. And then, of course, we saw the family separation policy, where babies were yanked out of their mother's arms at the border. It shamed us as a nation. And I remember when I was doing my book, I was in Tijuana in a women's shelter, and there was a young Honduran mother she was 22, and she had an adorable 18-month-old baby boy in her arms. And she was going to go over the border because she needed political asylum. The American armed gangs in her hometown in Honduras had made life impossible for her. They were coming for her. They had told her they were going to take her baby. So she fled for her life and her baby's life. So she was there in the shelter, and she, of course, could not just sashay over the border as an American could into Mexico. And she was going to apply for asylum. And I told her, if you do this, they're probably going to take your baby away from you. This was at the height of the family separation policy. She had tears in her eyes, and she said, you know what a mother's love is? This baby that I love more than my own life, even if they take him away, I would rather that I know that he's somewhere safe and alive than know for certainty that I'll have to put him in a box 6 feet under the ground and never see him again. This was the choice that she was faced with. This was the choice that this country gave her. I mean, this is the country that, in a better time, fought for international asylum laws during the Holocaust, when again the nations of the world shamed themselves by turning away shiploads of Jews fleeing Nazi Germany. So the whole system of asylum conventions, which the US is a signatory to, these are the laws that we signed on to, and have now unilaterally suspended, illegally suspended, using the virus as a cover.
I've been thinking about how the amount of research that goes into the amount of stories that you collect in creating these books. And I was thinking, as a journalist, where do you think US media has succeeded and then maybe failed in terms of covering immigration?
So I think on the whole, there have been some amazing journalists reporting for mainstream publications. There's been a very lively debate about the economic issues around migration. But I think where we might do better, or we could do better, is presenting the human face of the migrant. And here's where the administration has been so successful in demonizing migrants as people who are coming here to take and to loot. So this is why in my book, I went out looking not just for the raw data, but also stories. You know, I'm at heart a storyteller. And I remember this one story which just broke my heart. And it's at a place called Friendship Park on the US-Mexico border. It's south of San Diego. And it's the only place along the entire 3,000-mile border where if you have family on the other side of the border and you want to see them, this is the one place where the US government, the Border Patrol, will, on weekends, for 10 minutes at a time, allow you to meet face-to-face with your family. But you meet through a thick, industrial, ugly iron mesh fence. So you go up there, and your family comes up on the other side, and you can talk for 10 minutes. And I spent 2 weeks reporting there, and it was some of the most heartbreaking reporting of my career. I saw a Mexican man who works in construction, and he had left 17 years ago because his mother was sick. And so he works brutally hard every day to send money back to her for her hospital bills. And now, as I was standing there, he was going to see his mom for the first time in 17 years. So he goes up to the fence, mom comes up to the other side, and he puts his face up. He told me later he could feel her breath on his face. And he said, "I miss you, Mama." And she said, "I love you." He says, "Are you eating right? You look too thin." The eternal question asked by our mothers. And they can't touch because there's a fence between them. But the gap in the fence is only large enough to put your pinky finger through. So mom puts her pinky up, he puts his pinky up, and they do this thing called the pinky kiss. And all along the fence, there are mothers and their sons, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, doing this kissing of the pinkies. And then after 10 minutes, the guards on the American side, not the Mexican side, tell them they have to go. And I thought, this is a brutal system we have imposed upon families. And that man who is working every day of his life to send money back to his mom, he's here not because he wants to see the lights of Broadway. He's here because he loves his mom and wants her to live. And given the socioeconomic conditions of the world we have, given what we've done to Mexico, to much of Latin America, he has no choice but to leave and to live in a country which often despises him, or certainly the government tells him that he is not welcome. That man is not a robber and a rapist, like our president brands him. He is, to me, an ordinary hero. And I think the media could do a better job in presenting these stories in these incredibly human terms, and present the sacrifices that these migrants make for their families.
I just want to quickly tell anyone that's watching right now, if you have questions that are popping into your head right now, or there's something that you'd like to comment, the chat will be, it's currently disabled, but it will be on in a few minutes. I was curious too, so this this book was written in 2016. You've seen a lot more happening in the last couple of years. If you could add one more chapter to that book, what is something, or if there's something that you would have wanted to elaborate on more, what would you add?
Well, I think it would be the effect of COVID-19 and the racial justice protests on migration. So, as I said earlier, the virus has given this excuse to bigots and xenophobes all over the world to shut down their borders. And if I were to write a new chapter, I'd make an even stronger argument about how global migration and managed migration can actually help the world recover from this. We are now facing unemployment levels that we haven't seen since the Depression. One way to deal with this is to let in more immigrants, because immigrants, all the economic data shows, are job creators. For every tech worker that we let into this country, as Bill Gates once said, 5 American jobs are created. 70% of all the workers in Silicon Valley are immigrants. I would also focus on this reordering of the world after Black Lives Matter, and I've never seen social change happen so fast in my lifetime. In my own profession, journalism, the older power structure has really been shaken to its core as young people demand justice, not next year, but today. And I think the same argument can be made about this kind of global inequality. And the worst is yet to come as climate change really kicks in. We Americans are 4% of the world's population, but we put 1/3 of the world's excess carbon into the atmosphere, and European countries underport. As a result, people in India, in Nigeria, are literally roasting to death. And a bill has to be paid. And so these protests, the racial justice protests, have, I didn't think it would have been possible. If you told me this last year, that all these Confederate statues would just be toppling like 9 pins, that if the heads of powerful media organizations would be making way for more diverse workforces, I wouldn't have imagined that change would happen so fast. And maybe change can also happen when it comes to our treatment of migrants. And it's not something, I'm not arguing for something radical. I'm arguing for the way things have always been on the planet. That we have always moved across this beautiful blue-green planet of ours to make a better life for ourselves and our families. And the ending of my book is just that I live in a home which has many rooms. In fact, I live in a palace. It's called Earth.
As you're saying, though, these aren't radical policies. We have been able to do this in the past, or countries like the U.S. have been able to bring in immigrants before. I also think, though, that history has also shown the opposite, right? I think of the Chinese Exclusion Act. I think of times when Jewish immigrants were turned away. I think of current politics now. And so I wonder, too, how do you think, I can tell that this book is very strong in terms of obviously being supportive of immigration. But I know that for folks that are from rural white areas who say, the system still hasn't worked for me and I feel left behind and I feel in competition with immigrants, where do you think your book can meet them where they're at?
Right. So we've always had a history of bigotry in this country. Benjamin Franklin in the 1700s started railing against this group of people. He said, they don't speak our language, they don't worship our gods, all these outsiders, call them the Palatine Boers. He was talking about Germans, the ancestors of the current president, trying to come into the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So, and there was, of course, the Know Nothing Party in the 19th century, which railed against Irish Catholics, for example. But I do understand the plight of working class white Americans, working class Americans of all kinds, who genuinely felt the brunt of the Great Recession of 2008, for example. And I actually have a whole chapter in my book where I go to these industrial towns in Pennsylvania, for example, and I see how their future was stolen from them. But their future wasn't stolen from them by Latino farm workers. It was stolen by the elites in Wall Street. But the elites on Wall Street, being no fools, know that these people out in the industrial regions of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania might come for them with pitchforks. So they need their anger, their outrage diverted. And who better to divert their rage on than the newest, the weakest, the migrants? Hannah Arendt calls it the alliance between the mob and capital. And so, there are also sane ways that we can deal with. There's an argument to be made that if we just let in lots of people, that Americans who dropped out of high school can be affected because they're competing for the same jobs. And this is an argument that needs to be treated with respect. But then the way you deal with this isn't by just shutting the borders. It's by A, making sure that more Americans stay in high school, more of the native born stay in high school, and B, by taking some of the money that large companies like tech companies that benefit by having more immigration and charging a fee or a tax or a levy on them and earmarking that revenue for communities that are affected by immigration, like communities at the border or schools in the inner city that are dealing with an influx of new migrants. There's intelligent ways of revenue sharing or directing these immigrants to parts of the country where they are needed. So, for example, Baltimore and Detroit are losing populations at dramatic rates. They're big empty spaces. And it costs $50,000 to destroy a house, to demolish a house in inner city Detroit. And it costs $1 to bring in an immigrant family and say, if you live in the inner city for 5 years and work here and build a community here, and after 5 years you'll get a green card. There's actually a proposal called the Heartland visas, which have been endorsed by a huge number of mayors, which is calling for exactly this. So there's an intelligent way to deal with some of the harsher aspects of a lot of people coming into the country at the same time. But the debate about immigration is anything but intelligent. It's all heat and no light.
I did want to ask you one question too. Can I hear somebody? No. I was thinking about, I wanted to get to something a little bit more personal in the book, right? You had talked about this experience being bullied when you were in school. And then later on, you tell a story about your son and his experience going into school as well. Can you tell it for all of us to hear?
Sure. So I came to Jackson Heights in the borough of Queens in New York, which is arguably the most diverse neighborhood in the country. But when I got there, my parents put me in the nearest Catholic school, because in India, all the Christian schools are the good schools. And it happened to be an incredibly racist school, an all-boys school in which I was the first minority. And I learned to run very fast in that school, let's just say. And when my son was born, this was in the East Village in New York, we raised him speaking Gujarati, which is my language and the language of Mahatma Gandhi, incidentally. And then when it came time to put him in school, he was around 2 years old in preschool, I took him to the nearest preschool in Dubai and left him there for a couple of hours. And when I came back, I noticed that he was just playing by himself. The other kids couldn't talk to him. So then we put him in this other school, which was focused on music. And I explained to the teacher that he would need a period of transition in transitioning to English. And the teacher said, "Don't worry, when you bring him here for the first time, bring a song that he knows in his own language." So then I take my son to his first day of this new school, and he was apprehensive. He looked at all these kids who were looked different from him, spoke in this language he didn't know. And there was this teacher sitting at the piano, and I made this cassette of a lullaby that I would sing for him. And it goes la 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 lori, and the teacher listened to the tape, and she started banging out the song on the piano. She said to all the other children, she said, "Children, this is Gautama, and we will learn a song in his language." And she starts singing the song, and all the other kids, all the little American and French and Japanese kids, all start singing this song. And my son was amazed. And by the end of the week, he was speaking English. And he figured out that if all these kids were willing to learn his language, then why shouldn't they be willing to learn their language? And that teacher really taught me an amazing lesson. She was obviously a fabulous teacher. And I thought, we're asking all these immigrants who are coming here to instantly be fluent in English. It's not going to happen. It'll take a period of transition. And what if during that period of transition, we don't insist on English only? We say, teach me a little bit of your language, and then I'll teach you a lot of my language. Right? It can go both ways. So again, I'm not calling for open borders. I'm calling for open hearts and open minds.
Okay, and I'm going to check if, nope, the chat is still disabled, but, oh wait, there we go. I'm looking on the wrong spot. Okay, so one of the questions from Town Hall Seattle is, can you talk about the threat that has been made against birthright citizenship? What effect do you see that having, and how will that change our understanding of citizenship?
Yes, well, this birthright citizenship bogey has come up again, and obviously it springs from incredibly racist motives. So it was used against Obama, and now it's being used against Kamala Harris, of all people. There was a despicable column in Newsweek written by an alleged law professor who was saying we ought to raise questions about whether Harris, who was born in Oakland, for God's sake, can be considered a national born citizen because of parents for immigrants. And Trump, of course, lost no time at all in broadcasting and amplifying this racist claim, because, of course, he was the one who spent years questioning Obama's claim to be president. It's going to come up. It's going to come up against Harris, and there'll always be a certain loony fringe that will challenge people, particularly children of immigrants. And it was interesting that the same law professor who wrote this racist column also wrote another column saying Ted Cruz, who was born in Canada, shouldn't be disqualified from running for president because he's the son of American citizens. So this birthright citizenship thing, I think it's hogwash. There's all this talk about anchor babies and withdrawing birthright citizenship, but I don't think it has any serious chance of going forward unless you change the constitution, or unless you can get a majority of the Supreme Court to agree with you on this racist premise. And much as I disagree with any of the Republican judges on the court, I don't even think that they would go this far.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's another question. It says, currently there doesn't seem to be the political will in the US to address immigration reform. Is there anything we can do to move the needle on this?
That's a very correct observation. There isn't a political will. There hasn't been political will for the longest time, even under Democratic administrations. I mean, Obama was called a deporter-in-chief because he deported, until recently, more immigrants than Trump was deported. Although, of course, he did, then towards the end of his term, exercise political will in passing the executive order that led to DACA, the protection of the dreamers. I think that broadly, Americans need to be reminded of the American exceptionalism. And that's not that we're the greatest country on the world because Trump says so. The American exceptionalism is basically this. It's a great country because it's made up of all the other countries. And at its founding, it was supposed to be this nation of immigrants. And for much of its history, it has been. It's also been a country of resistance to the newest wave of immigrants. But, as I say in my book, I've lived in England and in France and in Brazil, and I never could feel properly English or French or Brazilian. But, I feel American. And what makes me feel American is that I also have the freedom to criticize the country and to hold it to account, which I take as my patriotic duty. So in terms of this kind of political will, we need to move the needle essentially one story at a time. I don't think it's going to happen even if Trump leaves office. It's not going to happen soon because it's a scared country right now. And polls show that, some polls show that the majority of Americans agree on restrictions on immigration for economic reasons. They think that with all this kind of unemployment right now, we need more restrictions on immigration. Well, this is where people who have the economic evidence, and there's a vast body of in my book, I've actually taken the trouble to speak to a lot of economists, read a lot of dense economic papers, and kind of compile the package into this readable package of stories and statistics and arguments. You can think of my book as ammunition. During Thanksgiving, when your racist uncle starts spouting, not your racist uncle, but one, starts spouting all these phrases that he might have heard on Tucker Carlson or read in Ann Coulter's tweets. Here's the evidence that immigrants come to this country and create jobs, not take them. That the country would suffer even more if we used the pandemic to shut out immigrants. I mean, take student visa, for example. I teach at a university, New York University, which is, like most universities, under severe financial strain. And the administration's response to this was to ban foreign students who were enrolling for online-only classes. Well, the dirty little secret of American universities is that we rely on foreign students paying full freight to keep ourselves in business. If it weren't for Chinese and Iranian and Indian and Brazilian students paying full tuition, the American higher education system would go bankrupt. And so what does the administration do in response to this? Saying that people who, even if you're staying in your country and you're paying all this money and you're willing to take an online-only class, saying you've got to basically just stay in your country. You cannot come into this country, right? So it's an incredibly self-defeating move. I mean, it's on par with Brexit, which I also write about in my book. The biggest own goal in British history, caused by fear of migrants, in which Britain withdrew from the EU and then basically its economy plunged off a cliff. It's got the worst performing economy in the EU right now, and much of it is because the xenophobes triumphed. So to move the needle about the debate, you have to have, I think, three things, which is stories, statistics, and statements. So you need the human stories to move the hearts, and then the stories can't just be anecdotal. They've got to be backed up by numbers, so that it's not just an individual anecdote. And then the numbers and the stories have to add up to a strong argument that is made for immigration, and this is where our politicians come in. But I think it can happen because I saw this firsthand. And the ending of my book, the hopeful part, is a story about my brother-in-law. So in 2016, that horrible year that Trump got elected, my brother-in-law, who is an Indian American living in North Carolina, in Raleigh, called me up and said, I want to run for state senate in North Carolina. And I said, in the deep South? Like, what are you talking about? And he had never run for political office before. And he had a safe job working for the state treasurer. I said, no, I think I can do it. He was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And he started knocking on doors. His opponent in a district that was over 90% white, 95% white, I think it was a white American who was chair of the League of North Carolina Municipalities, who just assumed that that Senate seat was his by divine right. So Jay, my brother-in-law, started knocking on doors, and I went down, and my sons also started knocking on doors. And my younger son had a gun pulled on him. I had a dog set on me, although it was a small dog, a poodle named Chewy. They can be vicious, these poodles. We knocked on doors, and my brother-in-law talked to people about what was important to them, which was about schools. The Republican Senate had defunded public schooling in North Carolina, and people's kids weren't being educated. And they saw him, and he started talking to them about raising teachers' salaries. And you know what? He got elected in a landslide. He was the first Indian American state senator in North Carolina history, and he's now the chief whip of the Democratic Party. And indications are that the Democrats will win in the North Carolina Senate, even though it's a grotesquely gerrymandered state. And my brother-in-law might be the majority leader. So it showed me what is possible in this country, and that all politics is local. This is why I'm hopeful of being able to move the needle. But you've got to be willing to fight for it. You've got to be willing to go out in the street and protest, and you've got to be willing to knock on doors, and you've got to be willing to engage in the public sphere. But I think this year, with the Black Lives Matter protests, they also taught me that yes, in this country, anything is possible.
Thank you so much for your time. I don't see any further questions. And I like the story that you just told. So I'm like, okay, let's leave a good feeling for the people that are listening in right now. Is there anything else that you would like to add or you wish we talked about?
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. And I urge everyone listening to, go out and vote, of course, and go out and organize. There really is an existential battle for the future of the planet itself on the first Tuesday in November. I have more to say about this in an op-ed that the Washington Post will be publishing that I've written about Trump's farce of a naturalization ceremony, and that's coming out this weekend. And also the New York Times just went online with an interview that the architecture critic Michael Kimmelman did with me about my neighborhood where I grew up, Jackson Heights in New York. So that just went online in the New York Times, and anyone who's listening is welcome to look that up.
Perfect. And of course, if you're interested in buying the book, there is a button that should be at the very bottom. Buy the book. Suketu Mehta, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Esmy.
And on behalf of Town Hall, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening, and thank you both to Suketu and Esmy for being here as well. If you enjoyed this event, you can find many more like it on our website, townhallseattle.org. we hope you will consider making a donation to Town Hall Seattle, as your support will allow us to continue to provide events just like this one. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through our friends at the Elliott Bay Book Company. And finally, thank you again for being here. Have a great evening.